Well, what's up, biology students? We are going to do a little bit of skills review. We're looking today at reading graphs. Now, here's the deal. Today, we're going to just look at some real general graphs, ask you guys to think about how to read graphs. And then tomorrow, you're going to look at some pretty cool graphs having to do with COVID. So this is practice. Tomorrow, it's like, all right, look at COVID data, look at COVID graphs. Let's see what kind of stuff you can discover. So with that said, let's begin our graph reading practice. All right. My handy laser pointer. All right, here we go. Okay, so remember, when we're reading line graphs like we're about to see, you always got to think about three questions. What is the independent variable? What is the dependent variable? And then ultimately, like, what conclusion does the data support? There's a relationship between independent and dependent variable, and that is that the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. All right, so let's talk about what we're looking at. So imagine you see a graph where there are two variables, the hours of sunlight and bacteria population. And we can ask the question, what depends on what? Does the hours of sunlight depend on the bacteria population, or does the bacteria population depend on the hours of sunlight? Well, according to this graph, the bacteria population depends on the hours of sunlight. So we're thinking that if there are a ton of bacteria, because up here there's more than 9,000 bacteria, that is because there is no sunlight. And then if you follow the line down, you can see over here at the end where there is a ton of sunlight, 24 hours of sunlight to be precise, then there is almost no bacteria. So like a conclusion we might reach is when there is 24 hours of sunlight, there is no bacteria. Remember those three questions again, kids. What is the independent variable? What is the dependent variable? And what conclusion does that data support? Well, in this case, bacteria depends on sun. And a conclusion could be if there is a ton of sun, there is no bacteria. Another conclusion can be if there is no sun or little sun, there is a lot of bacteria. All right, that's just one example. Let's look at another. All right, so here we have a graph where we see the number of butterflies and the population of, or the number of milkweed plants. So again, we look for the dependent and independent variables. Now, I don't think it makes any sense to say that the number of plants depends on the number of butterflies. Butterflies don't make plants, but the number of butterflies does depend on the number of milkweeds. And now the conclusion we can draw is the more milkweed plants there are, because over here there's 45 milkweed plants, the more milkweed plants there are, the greater the number of butterflies. Precisely, if there are 45 milkweeds, then there will be 113 butterflies. All right, so again, here, kids, the dependent variable is the number of butterflies. The independent variable is the number of milkweeds. And then the conclusion we're going to draw is kind of right up here. All right, so we've just looked at two pretty simple line graphs. Let's look at things that are a little more complex. And remember, you can and should be pausing and studying and thinking and going back to the slideshow without me talking to think to these questions. When I read a graph, what is the independent variable? What is the dependent variable? And what conclusions does the data support? All right, just some more examples. All right, so here's a tricky one because there are a couple of lines. So we can look to our key to understand what these couple of lines each mean. So I think, the short and easy of it here, kids, is that we are looking at plots of land. So picture like three different farm fields where here's one field or plot, here's a second field or plot, here's a third field or plot. Now, on the y-axis, it's going up and down. We see daily average soil temperature. On the x-axis, so going side to side, we see months and dates. Now, I'll tell you, we know for a fact that months and dates, those happen. Months and dates do not depend on temperature. Rather, temperature depends on month. So we know the daily average soil temperature depends on the date. And a conclusion we can reach, there are a lot of different conclusions, but here's just one. The soil in each plot is warmest between July 25th and July 30th. So I see, here are the three plots. They are warmest or highest up pretty much between, July 25th and July 30th. So again, here's the dependent variable. Soil temperature depends on the month, and then just one conclusion that soil or that is supported by this graph is the soil in each plot is warmest between 25 and 20, or July 25th and July 30th. You could offer different conclusions that this graph supports. This is just an example of one of them. All right, so here's the last one we'll look at together, guys. So again, this one's a little bit more complex, but it still has those questions. What is the independent? What is the dependent variable? What conclusion does the data support? So we know that on one side we see growth rate. Here we see sun exposure. So I'm going to go ahead and say that the sun exposure does not depend on the growth rate of plants. Rather, the growth rate of plants depends on sun exposure. And there are, 4 different plants being shown here. And that's why and that's what you can read in this key down here, the 4 different plants. So here you have one plant that clearly grows best with full sun and grows very poorly with full shade. Here you see one plant that clearly grows best with full shade, and does poorly in full sun. You see one plant that's kind of in the middle. So when you are thinking about dependent and independent variables, again, we know the growth rate depends on sun exposure. And we can draw a conclusion like, what is it? The geranium grows best under full sun and worst with full shade. We can say something like, let me see, like 3 out of 4 plants grow poorly with full sun. 1 out of 4 plants grows well with full sun. There are a lot of different conclusions that can be supported by looking at this graph. I've just shared 2 of them. All right, so remember, your next step is just to go and take a quiz. Now, heads up, the quiz is going to ask those same 3 questions about 2 of the graphs we just looked at. So please make sure you are studying the graphs, reviewing this video as many times as you need, and getting on to our quiz. I just want to see how you're doing. So good luck, everybody, and we're getting you ready to look at some real hardcore, real tough graphs about COVID-19 tomorrow. As always, reach out to Mr. Williams, myself, Ms. Check, or Ms. Carr if you have questions. We miss you guys. Go get them. We're rooting for you. Peace. How do I get out of this thing? I gotta end this show. Let's go to stop.